Okay, everybody. So in this video, we're going to review observational research, mostly some issues with observational research and what we can do to address it. So I want you to keep that in mind. We're talking about observational research. As you remember, hopefully, observational research is research studies where you're actually observing somebody's behavior. It might be in lab, it might be in their home, it might be on a playground, right? The point is you're there observing, you might be videotaping. Now, in these situations, ideally, right, the goal is to systematically report behaviors, but it's more than that. You're systematically recording and analyzing behavior. You've come up with a definition of what it is you're measuring. You've trained other researchers to make the same observations, and then you're comparing notes to make sure you're on the same page, right? Now, some scientists would argue that this approach is better to self-report. Now, this is because in self-report, well, we might be biased in how we report our actions. We want to look good. Maybe we're reporting on what we did in the past or what we want to become in the future. So if I'm asking you, or if I'm being asked about how often do I go to the gym, I might tell you how much I went to the gym before we went online versus what I'm actually doing now, which is actually less. I should be doing more, right? So that's the issue with self-report. If I'm doing observational research and I'm looking at, well, how often are professors working out? Then I could look at professors and see, well, are you actually working out? How much exercise are they actually getting in versus relying on you to tell me the truth or to be accurate, right? So the issue with this is that there's some biases we have to deal with. The first one, well, some biases particular to observational research. The first one is observer bias. Now, this specifically has to do with our expectations as researchers. So the researcher's expectations influence how you interpret the behavior. Now, it might be the same behavior that somebody would assess as violent, but somebody else would assess it as non-violent, right? For example, you might have children playing on the playground. You're measuring violence between children, just how much violent behavior they engage in, or aggressive. Violence sounds a little harsh. So aggressive behavior, and you count tap on the shoulder, like punches on the shoulder, and somebody else might be, no, that's just how kids play sometimes. It might be aggressive play, but it's not actually aggressive, right? So your bias in terms of what you interpret, maybe you want to find more aggression among boys and girls. Your bias might interpret how you interpret that playful behavior. So rather than seeing it as play, you're going to use it as, no, that's aggression, right? So your preconceived notions, the ideas you bring with you, and biases influence how you're interpreting that same situation. Now, for example, here you have two evaluators on the bottom evaluating a video of a single person, and you can see the different types of evaluations, right? Now, the reason why you're getting different types of evaluations is because in this study, the people making those evaluations were told that there was different purposes that these videos were made for. Some people were told, well, these are videos of people interviewing for a job. And some people were told, well, these were videos made with therapy sessions, right? Now, based on that, what was it finding? So in the study performed by Langer and Abelson in 1974, it was kind of interesting, right? Because you had Freudians, people who were trained in this way of doing therapy, that were told to watch a video and assess this person's behavior. Now, here's the thing. Some of these Freudians, so people who are trained in psychoanalysis, were told, well, this is an interview video. They were interviewing for a job. The other half were told, well, this is actually a patient, and this is a session they participated in. Now, here you can clearly see how our preconceived ideas of what's going on in that situation leads to a completely different interpretation of behavior. For people who were told it was an interview, not just people, Freudians, right, therapists trained in this way. For those who were told that they were in a job interview, they were told, oh, this person is very attractive, very candid, very innovative. Those people who were told this person was in a therapy session, instead of kind of regarding them positively, they reacted by saying, well, this person is very serious, a very defensive person. So this kind of shows how your expectations going in is going to change, it could change how you interpret the behavior you're observing, and we need to be very aware of that as researchers, right? We want to take into account our biases and try to weed those out so we don't let them change how we interpret an observation. But at the same time, I would argue it's not possible to remove bias. So rather, we want to be aware of our biases so we can be aware of that when we're interpreting behavior. Actually, I would say that's beyond research, not just in research, right? Now, the other type of effect that you could have in observational research is observer effects. So when you have an observer effect, it's not so much your interpretation of what you're observing, but just you being there leads for the participants to react in a more favorable way. And by favorable, I mean it's more in the direction of what you're expecting, right? So you being there, somehow you're giving some cues, some information that the participants are building off of that leads them to respond in a way that you expected, that aligns with your hypotheses. And this, I have pointed out that this can happen with humans and animals, right? So this is a very interesting study with rats. So they had maize dull and maize bright rats, or at least that's what the participants thought. They were actually all equally intelligent. There weren't any differences from them. They were the same type of rat. So, okay, so you might not agree with animal research, but just let me give you some background. In animal research, they can breed rats and have certain specific types of characteristics, including kind of intelligence level, right? But the point is, in this study, they gave people the same rats, same exact rats, and they told half of the participants, well, actually, let me take a step back. They told the participants, okay, we want you to have this rat go through this maze and just time it. Time how long this rat takes to get through the maze. And half of the participants were told, well, you actually have a maze bright rat. You have actually one of the smarter rats. The other half were told, you actually have a maze dull rat. They're not that bright. Now, it turns out that people who received the maze bright rats, and keep in mind, same rats, they just changed what they called them when they gave them to the participants. But those that were told they were receiving maze bright rats, in that situation, those rats overall finish the maze faster than the people who were told they have maze-dull rats. Same rats, only thing they're changing is whether they're calling them maze-bright or maze-dull. These participants, of course, didn't know that this was going on, and somehow, we're not sure why, the people who thought they had the smarter rats, those rats finished faster. Now, there might be some cues. Maybe we're giving them hints with our body language. Maybe we're rooting for a little rat to finish, and we can't help but have that bias, right? Come on, you're a smart rat. You can do this easily. And somehow they're picking up on that. Or somehow, maybe they're not picking up on it, but somehow it is influencing their behavior. So, observer bias, there's some bias in how we're interpreting the evidence. Observer effect, something about our presence leads to the participant, whether it be human or animal, to react in a favorable way, to react in a way that is in line with what we want to find. One thing you could do to counteract observer bias and observer effect is to have a very thorough code book. Now, a code book is where you design or you operationalize what you're measuring. So, for example, if you're measuring aggression among children, in this book, you would in detail outline what behavior counts as aggression, right? But even before that, you would go through a whole process of figuring out, well, is that aggression? Is that not? Include other researchers and weed out the bias so you're not including just your point of view, which most likely is going to be biased. And then you train the observers very well. They go through extensive training. You make sure that they understand how you're measuring, what you're measuring. You check throughout, you check among the observers that they're sticking to the original operational definition and not drifting back to their own ideas of aggression. And this is pretty much what you can do in this kind of situation, right? You should have this extensive training. You should have a well-defined code book, and you should definitely have, I was kind of alluding to this, but you should definitely have more than one observer. Now, there are issues with observer bias and observer effects that we can also address in the actual design of the study. One thing you could have is a masked study design where the observers themselves are unaware of the condition that the participant is in, right? So for example, if you had a condition where somebody was getting a placebo versus real medication, and you're observing, well, how much concentration is this person paying during lecture? Right? You have some concentration medicine. How well are they concentrating during lectures? What you're measuring, you as a person measuring should not know which person is receiving the actual medication that we're testing and who's getting the placebo. So you wouldn't know if that person that you're assessing has a placebo or is actually getting the real treatment. And actually, that ideally, that researcher shouldn't have any knowledge about the research question. I'm going to ask you to measure how much attention they're paying. You don't even know why I'm asking this. You don't even know what my research question is. You just know that I'm asking you to measure attention, and this is how I'm asking you to measure attention. Hopefully, that way, we're removing observer bias, meaning you're not more likely to interpret some behavior as attention because you know they actually received the real medicine, and because you know if you knew they received the real medicine, you might influence their behavior in a favorable way. Hopefully we don't have that because you don't know who's getting the real medication. You don't even know what they're getting medication about if you're blind, right? Now, traditionally, you might have heard of double blind as well. This is when the participant and the researcher don't know which condition they're in, right? So I would argue that the masked study design, this is kind of an implicit part of that, that the participant should also not know if they're getting the placebo or the real medication. So that's one way to address this. You can use a masked study design, also known as a blind study design. Now, there's those two types of effects that can happen with observational research. We also have reactivity. So reactivity is where your behavior, the participant's behavior, changes just because they're being observed. You have this creepy guy on the not me, but the guy on the slide observing you, and that's going to change how you behave, right? It might make you a little bit nervous. You're not going to act like you normally do. If I'm watching you have a conversation with friends, your conversation is going to change because you know people are listening to you. So this just isn't referring to the observer effect. So it's not so much that I'm giving you cues to lead you to act in a way that's favorable to my hypothesis. It's just the fact that just by being observed, you're not going to act, the participants are not going to act as they would in real life. One thing that's interesting is that even, this is kind of weird, but even cockroaches being observed by other cockroaches will change their behavior compared to when they're alone, right? So just keep that in mind. Just the mere act of being observed, people act differently. For example, when I give a lecture, suddenly I get very conscious about my hand movements. What am I doing with my hands? Oh, they say don't move them too much. Okay, put them down. Wait, now you seem too stiff, right? So you become very conscious when you're being observed, and you don't act like you normally would. This is reactivity. So three solutions to reactivity. You can blend in. There you can see that husky blending in. You can kind of become part of everybody around that participant so they don't know they're being observed. Now, this would require you to have a different type of review of your study through IRB. This is the board that reviews your study for ethical issues, because essentially to accomplish solution one, you wouldn't be asking for consent, because if you're asking for consent, it's harder to blend in, but maybe you might ask for consent, so you do your best to blend the camera in so it doesn't stand out to them as much, right? But another thing you could do is observe people in natural situations. You could also do solution two. You could wait it out, meaning you familiarize and get the participants used to your presence, and over time, they just forget about you. Not completely, but they kind of return to more and more normal behavior the longer you're there. So that's when you see studies that happen in home settings. So there's been studies that observe children play at home, family dynamics, people having dinner. And what you can do is just observe weeks of data, weeks of dinner time. And then you don't analyze the earlier observations, you analyze the later situations, hoping that by that point, the participants return to their normal behavior. They're used to the camera, they're used to having you there, you've waited it out, now they're returning to their normal behavior. The other thing you could do, which we reviewed before, is you can measure some type of evidence in the environment that this behavior happened. So here I have measuring the behavior as a result. One thing you could do if you're looking at eating habits, instead of observing people actually eating, you can dig into the trash and look at the types of trash. Well, how much of it is fast food related? How much of it is, how many candy wrappers, how many soda cans, to get an idea of how unhealthy people are eating, right? Here I have soda bottles left in the trash can after lecture. I might go and check and see, well, how much sugar are people having, right? So that's another way you can observe behavior or get a measure of a certain behavior without relying just on how people are behaving in front of you, and you completely take out the bias because you're looking at evidence that was left by people when you didn't even observe, when you were not observing them, right? So keep in mind that you have these potential issues, observer bias, observer effect, and reactivity when you're dealing with observational data. This is specific to observational data, so keep that in mind.